"You monster!" she cried as the human set her bone without tools. The world returned as a symphony of wrongness. The shriek of tortured metal was a constant, underscored by the hungry crackle of fire. Acrid smoke, thick with the scent of burnt synthetics and ozone, clawed at the back of Kinthra's throat, making her cough, a wet, ragged sound that sent a fresh explosion of agony through her body. She was on her back, pinned by something heavy. Through a haze of pain, she saw the jagged wound in the ship's hull, a rent of twisted metal framing an alien sky of bruised violet and sullen orange. Movement snagged her attention. A silhouette, broad-shouldered and dark, moved with an unnerving calm through the chaos. The human, the prisoner from the vessel they had acquired. He moved with a quiet purpose that was an insult to the bedlam surrounding them, his steps sure-footed among the debris. Kinthra's hand scrabbled for the pulse knife that should have been strapped to her thigh, but her fingers met only torn fabric and the slick warmth of her own blood. With a surge of effort fueled by pure fury, she shoved the piece of bulkhead off her legs. The relief was instantaneous, immediately replaced by a white-hot spike of pain from her left leg that stole her breath and blurred her vision. She dared to look down. Her leg was bent below the knee, twisted at an angle so grotesquely unnatural that her mind momentarily refused to process it. The sharp, pale end of a shattered bone tented the skin of her shin. A guttural sound, half whimper, half snarl, escaped her lips. Her sharp, felinoid ears, usually swiveling to catch the faintest sound, were pinned back against her skull in a rictus of agony and rage. The human Francis had stopped and was now looking at her. His face, framed by a dark beard and curtain of damp, matted hair, was unreadable. He held no weapon, yet his stillness felt more dangerous than any threat she had ever faced. "Stay back, human," she hissed, the words catching on the dryness in her throat. He ignored her, his dark eyes fixed on her ruined leg. He took a step closer. "I said stay back." This time she put the authority of a xylotl warrior born into the command, the tone that had sent legions scrambling. He didn't even blink. He knelt, his movements economical and precise, bringing him far too close. She could smell the sweat and grime of captivity on him, a scent of something primal and unsettlingly alive. His gaze was clinical, analytical, as he studied the break. It was the look of a technician examining a faulty conduit, and it made her blood boil with a fresh wave of humiliation. "The tibia is shattered," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Compound fracture, it has to be set." "My medkit," she snarled, trying to push herself up before collapsing back with a cry. "Find it. It has a stasis field, a bone knitter." "I looked," he interrupted, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. There was no pity in his eyes, only a flat statement of fact. It was destroyed in the crash. Everything was. The finality of his words struck her harder than the impact itself. No tech, no instruments, no relief, just this savage, this broken ship, and a world that was already trying to kill them. "Then I will die," she spat, her pride a final brittle shield. "A warrior's death is preferable to being touched by your filthy hands." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed his face. It was the first real emotion he had shown. "You'll lose the leg, not your life," he corrected her, his tone maddeningly patient. "The tissue will go necrotic within a day. Sepsis will follow. You won't die quickly. It will be a long, feverish, painful process. But you'll be alive when the native scavengers start chewing on your feet. Or I can set the bone. It will be the worst pain you have ever felt, but you will keep the leg and you will walk again." He laid out the options as if discussing the weather. Her mind reeled. The casual brutality of his description, the sheer primitive horror of it, was beyond anything her sanitized, technologically buffered existence had prepared her for. Her people didn't break, and if they did, machines fixed them. "You have no tools," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I have my hands," he said. "I need to do it now, while the muscles are still in shock, before they begin to seize." He shifted his position, moving to straddle her uninjured leg, his weight pinning her hips to the ground. The intimacy of the position was shocking, a violation that transcended the physical. She thrashed, her claws extending instinctively, but he caught her wrists in one hand, his grip like forged steel. "Do not fight me, Kinthra," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it in his alien mouth was another violation. It will only make it worse. "You monster," she cried, the accusation torn from her lungs. He lowered his other hand to her broken leg, one hand gripping her ankle, the other pressing firmly just below her knee. He braced himself, his muscles cording in his arms and shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes, and for a searing instant, she saw a flicker of something that looked like regret. "I know," he said, his voice soft. Then he pulled. A universe of pure white agony consumed her. There was no thought, no time, only a singular, all-encompassing reality of pain. A sound ripped from her throat that was not a word or a scream, but the raw sound of a creature being torn apart. She heard a wet, grating crunch as bone scraped against bone, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. Her vision imploded into a pinpoint of light and then vanished entirely into blackness. Her last conscious thought was of his face, calm and focused, as he destroyed her. She drifted back to awareness on a slow, agonizing tide. Her leg was a singular, throbbing entity of pain, but it was a contained pain now, not the sharp, screaming agony from before. A low fire crackled nearby, casting flickering shadows against the twisted metal of a makeshift shelter. The heavy scent of rain-damp soil had replaced the smoke. Night had fallen. She was propped against a section of seating, her injured legs straightened and immobilized. Two contoured plates of hull metal were bound tightly on either side, secured with strips of fabric he had torn from the less damaged parts of her own uniform. Her skin was clean. The blood and grime had been wiped away. A water skin lay beside her, cool to the touch. Francis sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of a jagged piece of metal against a flat stone. The rhythmic scrape was a strangely calming sound in the oppressive silence of the alien jungle. The sounds from beyond the firelight were not calm at all. Chittering, guttural calls, and the rustle of things moving through the dense undergrowth. He had built their shelter in a recess of a rock outcropping, using larger pieces of the hull to create a defensible wall. He had been busy. She watched him, her mind a maelstrom of confusion. The monster who had subjected her to torture that would break an Imperial interrogator was now tending to her survival with the meticulous focus of a field drone. The brute force had been replaced by a gentle, almost tender precision. He had set the bone, then he had splinted it, cleaned her, given her shelter, and built a fire to keep the predators at bay. He must have sensed her gaze because he stopped his work and looked over at her. His expression was as impassive as before. He rose and came to her, carrying the water skin. "Drink," he said. It was not a request. She wanted to refuse, to fling the thing back in his face. But her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and dry. Pride was a poor substitute for water. She let him lift her head and press the skin to her lips. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she had drunk her fill, he set it down within her reach. His movements were efficient, his touch impersonal, yet the care was undeniable. Her mind struggled to reconcile the two realities, the brutal savage and the competent caregiver. They couldn't coexist in the same being. Xylotl were warriors, scholars, artists. They could be cruel, yes, but their cruelty was refined, political. The human's was primal, a thing of stone and bone, yet his mercy was just as fundamental. "Why?" she finally managed to rasp, the single word costing her a significant effort. He returned to the fire, picking up his makeshift knife. "Why what?" "Why help me? I am your enemy, your captor." He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb, seemingly more interested in the metal than in her question. "On this world," he said, his eyes on the fire, "there are no enemies, no captors. There are only the living and the dead. I have an interest in keeping you on my side of that line. You're the only one who might know how to work any of this tech if we find something that isn't scrap." It was a cold, logical explanation. It should have reassured her, placed their interaction back into a framework she could understand, one of mutual utility. But it didn't. She had seen the flicker of regret in his eyes just before he broke her. Logic couldn't account for that. She lay back, her body aching, her mind in turmoil, and listened to the sounds of the jungle as the human kept watch. Days bled into a routine dictated by the sun and their needs. Kinthra woke each morning to find Francis already gone, returning later with water or, if he was fortunate, something to eat. He brought her strange, tough-skinned fruits and once the roasted meat of some small, rodent-like creature. It was tough and stringy, but it was sustenance. Her initial refusal to eat the barbarian's offerings had lasted less than a day. Defeated by the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and his implacable silence, he would simply leave the food beside her and walk away. Their conversations were clipped, functional. "I need water. The fire is low. How is the leg?" He would check the splint twice a day, his large, calloused hands probing the bindings, his touch surprisingly gentle as he tested for swelling or heat. She found herself watching his hands as he worked. They were tools, scarred and capable, the same hands that had inflicted so much pain, now tending to her with a focus that was deeply unsettling. She started to notice other things about him, too. The way he moved with a predator's economy of motion, never a wasted step. The deep lines of exhaustion etched around his dark eyes, a testament to sleepless nights spent on watch. The quiet intelligence in his gaze as he studied the alien flora, cautiously identifying which plants the local herbivores ate and which they avoided. He wasn't a barbarian. Barbarians were loud, chaotic, wasteful. He was something else, something older. "You said you were a medic," she said one afternoon, her voice stronger than it had been. He was relashing the bindings on her splint. "I was," he replied without looking up. "Aboard a military vessel?" "No, deep space rescue and salvage." That surprised her. It was not a prestigious post, but it required an immense breadth of knowledge. Rescue medics had to be doctors, engineers, and survivalists all at once. They were the ones who went in when the machines failed and all the refined theories of the core worlds met the harsh reality of a vacuum breach or a failed life support system. "So you have done this before?" she asked. "Set bones without instruments?" "More times than I'd like to remember," he murmured, his fingers tightening a knot. "On ships in collapsed mines, after atmospheric skipper crashes, this is what we did. You use what you have." He finished his work and sat back on his heels. For the first time, she saw the full cost of their survival etched on his face. He was thinner than he had been, his features sharper, his eyes shadowed. He was keeping them both alive, and it was wearing him down. A strange, unfamiliar emotion stirred in her chest. It felt disturbingly like concern. The attack came at dusk. The predator was not one of the small, noisy scavengers she heard at night. It was a hunter. Sleek, six-legged, with a chitinous hide the color of dried blood, it moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying. It had been stalking their camp for an hour, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, a shadow that didn't quite belong. Kinthra's warrior instinct screamed. Her muscles tensed, her body straining to rise, to meet the threat, but she was anchored by her useless leg. The frustration was a physical sickness in her gut. "It's a stalker," she hissed, her voice low. "You can't outrun it. You must face it. Show no fear." Francis didn't reply. He was watching the creature, his head tilted, his expression one of intense concentration. He wasn't looking at it like a warrior sizing up an opponent. He was watching it like an engineer studying a problem. "Its rear legs are for sprinting," he said, almost to himself. "The front four are for grappling. See how it plants its weight before it moves? It's not agile. It's a creature of straight-line ambush." "Your analysis is fascinating," Kinthra snapped, her nerves fraying. "Now kill it before it decides we are dinner." Instead of grabbing the sharpened metal spear he had crafted, he began to gather things. A length of heavy cabling from the wreck. A jagged, heavy piece of the ship's engine block. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady, looping the cable around the base of a thick, low-hanging branch on a tree near the edge of their camp. He tied the other end to the engine block, hoisting it a few feet off the ground. "What is that pathetic thing?" she demanded. "A warning?" "A trap," he said simply. He took the roasted remains of the creature from the day before and placed it on the ground, directly under the suspended weight. Then he retreated to the fire, picking up his spear, and waited. The stalker, drawn by the scent of cooked meat, finally broke from the tree line. It moved low to the ground, its head swaying from side to side, its multiple black eyes fixed on the bait. Kinthra held her breath, her hand gripping a rock, the only weapon she could wield. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This crude, primitive plan felt doomed to fail. The creature reached the bait. It lowered its head to snatch the meat. As it did, Francis hurled a small stone, not at the creature, but at the branch holding the cable. The stone struck the wood with a sharp crack. The startled creature jerked its head up, and in that instant, its horn-like crest snagged the low-hanging loop of cable. It panicked, lunging backward. The cable pulled taut. The engine block, a solid mass of dead weight, swung from the branch like a pendulum. It caught the stalker square in the side of its head with a sickening crunch of chitin. The creature dropped without a sound, its legs twitching for a moment before falling still. Silence descended on the clearing. Kinthra stared, stunned. He hadn't fought it. He hadn't faced it. He had used its own instincts, its own power against it. He had outthought it. It was both an elegant and a brutally efficient solution. It was a strategy she had never conceived of. She looked at Francis, who was already walking cautiously toward the downed predator, spear held at the ready. A grudging respect, profound and undeniable, began to bloom in the wasteland of her contempt. While gathering the cabling for his trap, Francis had ranged further from the camp than before. He'd found another piece of their scout ship, a section of the outer hull, wedged between two of the massive slate-gray trees. What bothered him was the mark on it. It wasn't the scoring and ablation of atmospheric entry. It was a tight, circular pattern of melted metal, the signature of a plasma cannon discharge. Their ship hadn't just crashed, it had been shot down. He looked back toward the camp, toward the injured Xylotl warrior who slept under his protection. Her situation and his had just become infinitely more complicated. For now, he decided that information was a weight he would carry alone. The fever came on quickly. One moment Kinthra was lucid, watching Francis expertly butcher the stalker for its meat and hide. The next, a fire was lit behind her eyes, and the world began to warp at the edges. A deep, shaking chill seized her, though the air was warm. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Francis was at her side in an instant, his cool hand on her forehead. "Infection," he muttered, his voice sounding distant and distorted. He was already examining the deep lacerations on her arms and torso, wounds she had dismissed as trivial compared to her broken leg. One, on her side, was inflamed, the skin around it a dark, angry red. The days that followed were a blur of fever dreams and fragmented reality. She was trapped in a sweltering haze, adrift between the humid heat of the jungle and the burning heat of her own body. Time lost all meaning. She was a child again in the training halls of Xylos, the sting of the practice drone's laser on her skin. She was on the command deck of her first ship, the stars a cold, silent witness to her ambition. And through it all, there was Francis. He was a constant, grounding presence in her delirium. He was the cool, damp cloth on her forehead, chasing away the fire. He was the steady hand that lifted her head, patiently forcing water and a bitter, earthy-tasting broth between her cracked lips. He was the low, calm voice that murmured things she couldn't understand, anchoring her to the present when her mind threatened to drift away completely. Boundaries dissolved in the fever. Modesty and pride were luxuries she could no longer afford. He cleaned her wounds, his touch dispassionate yet undeniably intimate. He removed the torn remnants of her uniform to better tend to her skin, his gaze clinical as he worked, but she felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the infection. He kept her clean, bathing her with strips of hide dipped in precious water from their supply. In her moments of brief lucidity, the sheer intimacy of his care was more shocking than the crash itself. This human, this enemy, knew the landscape of her body better than any lover she had ever taken. In the depths of her delirium, she spoke. The words tumbled out, fragments of memory and fear. She spoke of the imperial court, of its shimmering surfaces and shadowed corners where ambitions festered. She spoke of her triumphs, the accolades that had marked her as a rising star. And she spoke of the jealousy that followed, the whispered words in hallways, the false smiles of her rivals. "My cousin," she mumbled, her tongue thick and clumsy. "Kalen, he said my death would be a glorious sacrifice, a martyr for the Imperium. He would see to it personally that my name was immortalized." Francis, changing the poultice on her side, went still. He had made the poultice from a broad-leafed plant with antiseptic properties, a desperate gamble based on watching what the local herbivores used to treat their own wounds. Her words, slurred and broken, landed with the force of a physical blow, connecting with the image of the plasma burn on the hull fragment. A glorious sacrifice. A rival who stood to gain. It wasn't a random attack by pirates. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution, disguised as a tragedy. Kinthra had been sent here to die. The realization settled in his gut like a cold stone. He was no longer just a survivor trying to keep his fellow castaway alive. He was a witness, a loose end. The line between caregiver and accomplice had just been erased. He was part of her story now, whether he wanted to be or not. He looked down at her, at the proud warrior reduced to a fragile, feverish woman. Her silver-white hair was plastered to her temples with sweat, her expressive ears drooping, her fangs parted as she breathed in shallow gasps. A fierce protective instinct, sharp and unexpected, rose in him. He would not let this world or her own people claim her. When the fever finally broke, it was like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. Kinthra woke to the soft light of dawn filtering into the shelter. The world was sharp and clear again, the fire in her blood extinguished. She felt weak, hollowed out, but she was alive. She was herself. She turned her head and saw Francis sleeping, slumped against the rock wall, the spear resting against his shoulder. He looked utterly exhausted, his face gaunt, but even in sleep, he seemed poised to spring into action. A profound shift had occurred between them. The insults, the arrogance, the master-prisoner dynamic, it had all been burned away by the fever. All that remained was a quiet, fragile awareness of their shared vulnerability. He had seen her at her absolute weakest, had tended to her most intimate needs, and he was still here. Later that day, he changed the dressing on her leg. The wound was clean, the swelling reduced. His work had been effective. As he secured the new binding, she found her voice. "You have scars," she said. He paused, then glanced down at his own forearms, which were a tapestry of old, faded marks. A long, thin white line that ran from his wrist to his elbow. A puckered, star-shaped burn on his bicep. "Everyone has scars," he said, his tone neutral. "Tell me about that one," she insisted, pointing a trembling finger at the long line on his arm. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed, a quiet exhalation of breath. Emergency hull patch. A micrometeoroid swarm. The alarm failed. We had 12 seconds to seal the breach before the compartment depressurized completely. My partner got the patch. I held the support brace. A piece of shrapnel from the initial impact caught my arm as I was locking it in. He spoke of it as if reciting a technical manual, but she could see the memory in his eyes. And the burn? Engine flareback on a salvage job, a Kazon freighter. Their engineering is optimistic. He told her the stories not with pride or bravado, but with a simple, factual weariness. Each scar was a record of a moment when technology had failed, when skill and luck were all that stood between life and a cold, silent death. His life was a litany of surviving the impossible. When he was finished, a heavy silence settled between them. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to reciprocate, to offer a piece of herself to balance the scales. "This one," she said, touching a small, intricate scar that coiled around her bicep, a mark of dark ink and deliberately raised tissue. "It is a mark of the Cathar, my first solo kill of a wild grazer. I was 12 cycles old. It signifies that the bearer is a hunter, no longer a child." He looked at the mark, then back at her face. He was truly seeing her, not as a Xylotl warrior or a prisoner, but as Kinthra, a woman with a history written on her skin, just as his was written on his. The air between them grew thick, charged with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the tension of conflict, but of recognition. The slow, dawning awareness of the man and woman behind the alien and the human. It was more frightening than any predator in the jungle. With Kinthra's strength returning, their small camp became a cage. They needed more resources, a more defensible long-term shelter, and most importantly, they needed to know what else had survived on this planet. Francis fashioned a crude but sturdy crutch for her from the leg of a command chair. Her first steps were hesitant, painful, but with each one a piece of her warrior's spirit returned. They traveled slowly, a strange pair moving through the alien landscape. He would scout ahead, clearing a path through the dense, vine-choked undergrowth, while she followed, her crutch sinking into the soft soil, her ears constantly swiveling, her sharp eyes scanning the canopy for threats. They learned to work together, to communicate with clipped phrases and simple hand gestures. A low hiss from her would make him freeze instantly. A sharp whistle from him would bring her to a halt. They were a single organism, his strength and her senses combined. It was on their third day of travel that they found it. Topping a ridge that overlooked a shallow valley, they saw a break in the canopy that wasn't natural. It was a scar of dead, brown vegetation and shattered trees. And in the center of it, glinting dully in the violet light, was the unmistakable shape of a crashed starship. It was much larger than their scout vessel, and the design was older, more brutalist in its angles. It was half swallowed by the jungle, draped in thick vines like a funeral shroud. "Is that," she began, her voice a whisper. "No," Francis said, his eyes narrowed. "It's not ours, but it's Xylotl." There was no mistaking the proud, soaring lines of the ship's prow, even crumpled and broken as it was. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled over Kinthra. This world was supposed to be uncharted, uninhabited. To find one wreck was a tragedy. To find two was a statistical anomaly of staggering proportions. They made their way down into the valley, the silence of the wreck oppressive. It felt like a tomb. A gaping hole in the side of the hull offered them entry. Inside, the air was stale and dead. Emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting long, dancing shadows. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The ship was empty. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle. It was simply abandoned. In what looked like an auxiliary bridge, a single console flickered with a desperate, tenacious spark of life, drawing power from a failing backup system. Francis ran his hands over the controls, his touch surprisingly deft. "The main reactor is dead, but the secondary data core has residual power," he murmured. He began to work, his fingers flying across the panel, coaxing the ancient system back to life. Lines of corrupted data scrolled across the screen. "What kind of ship was this?" Kinthra asked, her voice hushed. "The logs are mostly gone," he said, his focus entirely on the screen. "But the ship's designation is still here. It's a penal transport." He fell silent. "A penal transport," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Here? Why?" He didn't answer. His fingers stilled on the console. A single, uncorrupted file had appeared on the screen. It was an official transfer manifest, an exile order. He opened it. A list of names appeared, and below them, a final authorization signature. Kinthra leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the name of the supervising officer who had signed the order. It was a high-ranking official, a known ally of her cousin, Kaelin. And the destination listed for the prisoners was this unnamed planet, classified under a code name, Sanctuary. A final, chilling log entry from the ship's captain was scrawled at the bottom. "The fleet has jumped. They left us. Sanctuary is not a colony. It is a grave." All the pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The plasma burn on the hull, her cousin's talk of a glorious sacrifice. This ship, filled with political prisoners, discarded on a death world and left to be forgotten. She wasn't the victim of an accident. She was the latest shipment. "No," she whispered, the sound small and lost in the dead ship. Her entire life, her service, her fierce, unwavering loyalty to the Xylotl Imperium, it had all been a lie. She was not a warrior. She was refused, disposed of with bureaucratic efficiency. The betrayal was so vast, so absolute, it hollowed her out, leaving nothing behind but a screaming void. With a cry of pure animalistic rage, she slammed her fist into the console. The screen shattered, showering the deck with sparks and glass, plunging the bridge into darkness. Her strength gave out and she slid to the floor, her body racked with dry, choking sobs. Her pride, her identity, her future, all of it had been murdered, not here in the jungle, but in a quiet, sterile office millions of light years away. Francis didn't speak. He didn't offer her meaningless words of comfort or hollow promises of vengeance. He simply came to her in the darkness and knelt beside her. He was a solid, warm presence in the cold emptiness of the derelict ship. When her fury finally burned itself out, leaving only the shuddering, broken remnants of her grief, he reached out and pulled her against him. He held her, his arms wrapped around her shaking shoulders as she wept for her lost life. It was the first time they had touched for a reason other than medical necessity or violence. It was not the touch of a lover or a captor. It was the touch of one survivor holding on to another in the dark. And it was everything. In the quiet aftermath, huddled together on the cold floor of the dead ship, a new reality began to form. They were no longer Xylotl and human, warrior and medic. They were just Kinthra and Francis, two people betrayed and abandoned with a common enemy and a single unifying purpose: escape. The two wrecks were no longer tombs, they were a salvage yard. "The power core on our scout ship is newer," Francis said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness, his words cutting through her haze of despair. "The reactor is probably fused, but the energy cells should still hold a charge. This ship," he gestured vaguely at the darkness around them, "is older, but its long-range communications array is more powerful, designed to send fleet-wide signals, not just tight beam transmissions." Kinthra lifted her head from his shoulder, his logic a lifeline in the chaos of her emotions. "You think you can combine them?" "Maybe," he said. "If we can get the power cells from your ship here, and if the main antenna on this one isn't damaged beyond repair, I might be able to rig a distress beacon, a powerful one." A tiny, fragile spark of hope ignited in the ashes of her despair. It wasn't just a hope for survival anymore. It was a hope for retribution. If they could send a signal, they could be found. And if they were found, she could tell her story. She could expose them all. "We will do it," she said, her voice raw but steady. She was no longer a warrior of the Imperium, she was a warrior for herself, for him. The days that followed were a testament to their new alliance. The work was brutal, punishing. They made the slow, arduous journey back to their own crash site, a journey that felt entirely different now. They were not just wandering, but on a mission. Francis, with his medic's knowledge of anatomy and his engineer's mind, directed the operation. He knew precisely which components they needed from the scout ship's power assembly, how to discharge them safely, and how to disconnect them from the ruined reactor. The problem was their weight. The power cells were too heavy for him to move alone. That was where she came in. Her leg, though still healing, could bear her weight for short periods. Her upper body strength, honed by years of warrior training, was formidable. While he worked on the delicate connections, she stood guard, her heightened senses a living perimeter alarm. The faintest snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves that was out of rhythm with the breeze, the distant scent of a predator on the air, she perceived it all. More than once, her low warning growl stopped him from making a sound that would have attracted unwanted attention. Together, they levered the heavy power cells from their mountings. They built a crude sledge from a sheet of hull plating and began the painstaking task of hauling their prize back to the penal ship. It was a slow, torturous process. They strained together, muscles screaming in protest, their bodies slick with sweat. They worked as one, his grunted commands and her answering surge of strength, a conversation without words. In the evenings, exhausted, they would huddle by the fire, sharing the tough, tasteless meat of the creatures Francis managed to hunt. They talked, their earlier silences replaced by a quiet companionship. He would ask her about the stars in Xylotl territory, and she would describe the nebulae and constellations of her home. She would ask him about Earth, a place she knew only as a name on a chart, a primitive backwater. He described its oceans, its sprawling green forests, its chaotic, vibrant cities. The physical intimacy of their labor, the constant, close-quarters work, began to smolder into a different kind of heat. It was there in the moments his hand brushed hers as he passed her a tool. It was in the way she watched his muscles bunch and strain as he lifted something heavy. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her as she stood silhouetted against the setting sun, her silver hair catching the last light, her fierce profile a study in concentration. The unspoken desire between them became a tangible presence, as real as the humid air and the constant thrum of the jungle. They were forging more than a beacon. They were forging a bond, piece by painful, salvaged piece. The final connection was a delicate one. Francis sat before the comms panel of the old penal ship, now jury-rigged with wires and conduits that snaked across the floor to the salvaged power cells. Kinthra stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Every piece of their combined effort, every moment of pain and toil, had led to this. The antenna was aligned, the power cells were charged. All that was left was to throw the switch. It might not work, Francis said, his voice tight. The power draw could overload the archaic systems. It could all just fry. It will work, she said, her belief in him absolute. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the main activation lever. He turned his head, looking up at her. The flickering emergency lights carved his face into sharp angles of light and shadow. The exhaustion, the grime, the scars, she saw it all, and she saw the man underneath, the one who had set her bone, tended her fever, and stood with her in the face of utter despair. Kinthra, he began, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Before I do this, I need you to know, I'm not just fighting to get off this rock anymore, I'm fighting for you. The confession hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and more powerful than any poetic declaration she had ever heard in the imperial court. Her breath caught in her chest. Words were inadequate. Her people were poets and orators, but no words could capture the maelstrom of emotion inside her. Gratitude, respect, a fierce, possessive loyalty, and a desire so profound it was an ache deep in her bones. So she did not speak. Instead, she leaned down, her fingers tangling in his dark, rough hair, and pulled his face to hers. She kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, acclaiming. It tasted of sweat and blood and survival. It was the heat of the fever and the cold of the wreck, the pain of her broken bone and the triumph of the slain predator. It was a kiss that sealed their new alliance, a raw, passionate confirmation of the bond they had forged in fire and pain. In that single, searing moment, she was not a Xylotl and he was not a human. They were a new species born on this forgotten world. When the kiss broke, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. He looked into her eyes, and she saw her own fierce emotion reflected there. Without another word, he turned back to the console, his hand closing around the lever. His movements were sure now, decisive. He threw the switch. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a low hum began to build, vibrating through the deck plates. The lights on the panel flared, one by one, turning from red to amber to a brilliant, hopeful green. A schematic of the long-range antenna appeared on a side monitor, a pulsing wave of energy radiating from its center. It was working. The signal, a piercing, silent scream for help, was lancing its way into the void. They stood together, her hand still on his shoulder, his hand covering hers, and watched the signal pulse on the screen. It was a single point of light in an overwhelming darkness, a testament to their shared will. They didn't know who would answer their call. It could be a friendly merchant ship, a Xylotl patrol, or one of her cousin's ships coming to finish the job. It didn't matter. They would face it, just as they had faced everything else on this world. Together.